when we cultivate our curiosity to ask questions, to wonder, to learn things that we have never been exposed to before, first we connect things that have never been connected before, which leads to creativity and innovation. It gives us ideas for the craft that we do, right? But also it makes the process so much more joyful. It makes work and life more full and more interesting and more fulfilling, because we're constantly discovering and being in awe and amazement.
I am here today with Eduardo Briceño, who's a global keynote speaker and facilitator who guides many of the world's leading companies in developing cultures of learning and high performance. And you're also the author of the new book, The Performance Paradox: Turning the Power of Mindset into Action. And for anybody that wants to do a little bit of a superficial dive before they go right into the book, your TED Talk, How to Get Better at the Things You Care About, which I absolutely loved, by the way, and your prior TEDx talk about the power of belief combined have been viewed over 9 million times. So Eduardo, as we talked a little bit about off the record before we started, boy, did I get lucky with you falling in our lap, because I am going to thoroughly enjoy today's conversation. I can't thank you enough for taking the time.
Thanks, Zach, for having me. I look forward to the conversation.
Yes. So as I had mentioned a little bit before, and my guests may already know this because I probably mentioned it a time or two in passing. My bucket list of podcast guests include none other than your mentor, Carol Dweck. And if I had the option to get mutually introduced to Carol Dweck or Michael Jordan, I'd say, well, Michael can wait. I'd really like to see if we can get Carol Dweck on the calendar. And the reason I bring that up is because she's a very influential mentor of yours. And she talks about something that's called fixed versus growth mindsets. And she wrote the seminal book, Mindset, which I believe is the foundation of pretty much anything that you want to accomplish, anything that you want to achieve, whatever kind of life you want to build. I always tell my students, it starts with mindset. So in lieu of actually having Carol here, because she was so influential to you, where I'd actually like to really start, before we get to the performance paradox in your work, just kind of lay the basic foundation of understanding the importance of mindset and the difference between a fixed mindset and a growth mindset.
Absolutely. And yes, I agree with you. For me, growth mindset and fixed mindset has been completely life transforming. And for me, when I first learned about Carol's work, which was in 2007, I read her book and I met her. I just uncovered a lot of insights about how I was getting in my own way and how I was preventing myself from achieving things that I cared about, and how I was reacting defensively to feedback. So a lot of people have heard the term growth mindset, and when we ask people what a growth mindset means, for those kind of who know a little bit about it or even a lot, sometimes we hear it's about working hard or it's about persevering. And a growth mindset is none of those things. A growth mindset is not a behavior, it's a mindset. A mindset is a belief. It's a belief about the nature of human beings. Specifically, is the belief that we can change and that other people can change. And that's important. So it's as opposed to a fixed mindset, which is when we believe that we are fixed the way we are. Like, for example, if we think that we are naturals at something, like we're natural leaders or we're natural athletes, that's a fixed mindset. Or I'm not a math person, that's a fixed mindset. Like I can't get better as a leader, I can't get better at math, either because I'm really good or I'm really bad or in the middle. And what happens when we're in a fixed mindset is, first, we don't do anything to try to get better, because we're starting with the assumption that we can't get better, right? The reason people do things well is because they either have it or they don't have it. So it's not because of what they do to get better. We also then tend to not take on challenges that we can learn from and that can lead us to greater performance. We react defensively to feedback. When other people do things that are not like good things, like they, for example, do something passive aggressive, we tend to label them and think of them as evil, for example. So we tend to respond by retaliating, engaging in warfare. So it leads to conflict. And a growth mindset leads to us trying to get better, to soliciting feedback, to better listening to feedback, to asking more questions, to get it better learning what other people's preferences are, better engaging in conflict resolution so that we can better build relationships and collaborate. So there's a ton of behaviors that result from either having this assumption of humans being fixed the way they are, or humans being able to change. And that is, like you said, a foundation of both learning and achievement.
The simplest example that I can give of where I believe that I was largely not raised, but just kind of conditioned based on the traditional education system and a fixed mindset comes down to IQ tests and standardized scores. Right? I could literally go for 4 hours and do my own live impromptu TED talk about all the feelings that I have about traditional education and all the things that are broken about it. But as I was growing up, it was, you're in the smart group, you're in the dumb group, you're in the special group based on this score. And by the way, this number doesn't change. Your IQ is always going to be this number. You're always going to be in this range in your standardized test score, and your brain is fixed. And as soon as I learned about neuroplasticity, where literally on a neural level, your brain can change, but just the belief that if I not just apply effort and I grit my way through and I persevere, but I change my belief that things can change, and as I learn, I can improve, my entire life literally changed from I was in the gifted group, which, you know, seems like it would be a blessing, but it can also be a curse, because that's always just the expectation. Anytime I failed, well, then that means, like, using your words, you know, usually I was a winner. But then when something wrong, I became a loser. It became about identity and not just about performance or lack of skills or lack of experience. So I don't want to go into this too deeply, and I want to get to your work as soon as we can. But just back up my assertion as somebody that does this for a living in the academic world about how poorly we are trained in our current educational model to understand the value of mindset.
Absolutely, right on. Like, you know, just think about the term gifted. You know, you were in the gifted group. So that kind of implies that something was endowed on you and you are special, and that's why you can do these things at a higher level. And when you're doing those things successfully and getting straight A's, you might feel good about yourself. I am gifted, and that might like raise your self-esteem. But the problem, like you said, is when things get harder later and we don't get an A, or we start a job that is difficult, or we get some difficult feedback, then we tend to say, oh my God, like either this person is not saying something that's true, and we're trying to react defensively, protect our ego, or okay, I'm not this good, so I'm going to shy away from this challenge. I'm going to stay within my comfort zone. So we become more fragile, right? We stay within what we know how to do and what's comfortable to us. So there's a lot of things about the education system that tend to put us into a fixed mindset. And also, you know, a lot of these things are unintentional. We all have kind of our best intentions also in our homes, right? In our homes, we might praise kids for being smart, for example. You know, they do something well and quickly and without effort and without mistakes, and we say, you're so smart. And we do it with our best intentions, thinking that will raise their confidence and they'll be able to go after hard things because they're smart. But the reverse happens, right? They shy away from challenges. They want to continue showing and proving rather than improving. So they stay within what they have already done well, so that they can continue to be told that they're smart. And when they encounter challenges, they are a lot less resilient. They shy away. They don't want to try anymore, because if they try and fail, it makes them feel not smart.
What I learned through years and years of conditioning, I learned how to do what I was told, show up on time, complete all of my homework, complete it at a high level, because I do have a certain scholastic aptitude, right? That is just an advantage that I was given by genetics. But given all of that, what I really learned how to do was the formula and the habits necessary for a certain type of success. And then the giant rude awakening that I had was that the most fundamental skill that I had never learned, that was never developed, that was never impressed upon me, is the skill of learning how to fail. I was really good at success and I was horrible at failure. And that was when I started to dig into this idea of mindsets and realized that failure is the key. Like that's the secret weapon. So now when people ask me, you know, what's different about you and what differentiates the success that you've had in Hollywood or as an online podcaster or entrepreneur, the first thing I say is there's nothing special about me. I am no different than anybody else. The difference is I'm willing to fail faster than you are. That to me has been the key, which was the shift from fixed to growth mindset.
Absolutely. And you brought genetics, and to that point, growth mindset doesn't mean that everybody kind of is born the same and we're all just a product of our environment and what we do. There are genetic differences, but the thing is that each of us can significantly get a lot better in anything, or in lots of different skills and qualities. And if we focus on that, then we grow a lot more and we achieve a lot more. And the people who become the best in the world, they all work to get better, because if you don't, then you're never going to be a very, very skilled person. And to your point about failure, yes, when I was doing the research for this book, I learned how important. I knew mistakes and failure were important. I've talked about even those in the TED Talks that you talked about. But I didn't know how important it was. So it turns out that you mentioned neuroplasticity. A brain's neuroplasticity works from just experience up to the point of our mid-20s. So if we're just walking around the world and we're seeing things, our brain is reconfiguring just from observing and being part of those experiences until our mid-20s. From our mid-20s on, the way the neuroplasticity works kind of changes. And then that doesn't happen as much. And the way that it actually the brain changes is from mistakes and failure. So it's from making predictions that turn out not to be true and that surprise us. And we realize, oh wow, like this is something that I thought worked differently, and now I realize that things are actually different than I thought. So to your point, whether it's entrepreneurship or creative endeavors, I mean, those are two fields where failure is so important, because we are going into uncharted territory, right? We have to test, we have to iterate, and that's about experimentation, doing things that may or may not work, and learning from failure and getting better along the way.
So one of the things, one of the most important questions that I want to make sure we answer by the end of this conversation is, how do we create an environment and create habits that are going to lead to this consistent learning and failure and growth? But I feel like that's a little bit further down the road, so I want to put a pin in it. But what I want to dig into a little bit deeper, and this is going to be kind of threading your narrative with my narrative, so I'm going to do this as deftly as possible. But I believe one of the areas where the education system has massively failed us, and it has really helped succeed for those, the top, not even 1%, but 0.1% of people that are owning all of these companies and corporations and businesses, is the amount of specialization. Where from preschool, the first question we're asked is, what do you want to be when you grow up? And then we have to be in a specific magnet program by middle school. We have to know what our college is by high school, and we have to have a major by the time we're 19 years old and know the direction of the rest of our life, which has served the factories and the industrialized system and the corporations very, very well. But I see this transition now back to generalization with the advent of artificial intelligence and just frankly the economy in general becoming much more gig-based and having more of a broad diversification of skills. So I want to get a sense from your mind how we can apply this idea of the growth mindset to navigating all of this, but also at the same time helping us better understand how much of this really is, I just need a different mindset and I can make anything happen, versus I do have natural talent or aptitude. Because like you said, it's a little bit of both. But how do you just not fall into the trap of, well, I'm just a naturally gifted athlete, so I guess that's what I need to work on, versus, well, I'm not as naturally gifted in this thing, but I'm more passionate about it. We're really going to have to diversify both what we're already naturally good at and the things that we have to learn. So I realize there's a lot there, but the simplest version of it is, how do we apply these two different mindsets to lead us to deciding what we want to focus on next, and thus learning more about this performance paradox, which is where we're going, right after this.
Sure. It's there's a lot there. Yeah. So let me start kind of with this education system. I completely agree with you. So first of all, schools haven't been tasked with developing learning skills, right? And which is I think the most important thing that schools could do is develop us as lifelong learners, people who are skilled in continuing to develop whatever we want to develop, throughout our lives. And our interests are going to change, our passions are going to change. We're going to be, discovering new things and wanting to do new things in the world. How do we develop those skills as we go through life? Schools are not designed to do that. They're not even tasked to do that. That's not the goal. So I, like many other people, I was very curious and and creative little kid until I got to school. When I got to school, then I started learning things that were irrelevant, that were not useful, and it became kind of rote learning, that where the goal was just to get a good grade and pass the test and go to the next level. And so the most influential thing that I learned in school is that learning sucks, is that learning is boring, it's irrelevant, it's useless, and what a tragedy, right? And so I think in the ideal world, we would want to just nurture that. And there's research that shows that kids, the number of questions that kids ask every day drop precipitously when they start going to school, right? Because they become a lot less curious. And so ideally, we would want to be in an environment where we can identify what we're interested in and explore and tinker and do projects around those things and just pursue our interests, right? So to your point about, how do I determine what I want to do in my life and what I want to pursue? I think that what we're interested in, what intrigues us, is so powerful, and we can become great at it, because becoming great at something requires huge commitment. It requires passion. It requires thinking about these things, not just at work, but when we're having fun and when we're going, out for a walk with friends or whatever. And it also doesn't mean that we are only focused on that narrow thing, to your point. Like, the breadth is so important. If you look at the Nobel Prize winning scientists, they're about 20 times more likely to engage in hobbies in the arts and the performing arts than other successful scientists or the general public. And so, Einstein played the violin. So when we cultivate our curiosity to ask questions, to wonder, to learn things that we have never been exposed to before, first we connect things that have never been connected before, which leads to creativity and innovation. It gives us ideas for the craft that we do, right? But also, it makes the process so much more joyful. It makes work and life more full and more interesting and more fulfilling, because we're constantly discovering and being in awe and amazement. So the understanding that the focus of our attention, that we can learn how to do the things that interest us and intrigue us and explore those things and tinker with, what might be here and what might this lead me to, or just for the benefit of, hey, I'm curious about this question, let me spend an hour or an afternoon looking into it or asking questions about it. That leads to, incredible fruits afterwards.
If we didn't have another 64 minutes, I'd say that was a mic drop moment, and it was amazing having you here today. I'm already done. I've reached all of my objectives, and you completely hit a home run on my point. And I've never heard somebody put it so succinctly, and I'm probably going to outright steal this, is that the only thing that schools taught us is that learning sucks. That is such a perfect encapsulation of it, because what we don't learn how to do is learn. We learn how to regurgitate, we learn how to retain information, and given all the technology we have available to us today, all of that is absolutely useless. We don't need to retain information. We have phones that can do that. We now have AI that can even synthesize basic ideas that have been synthesized before. Our ability to learn how to learn is what's going to set us apart and allow us to chart these new paths. And the reason that I'm really hitting this point home is because I hear so many of my students and my clients that say, why am I struggling so much? And I reset the expectation. You shouldn't know how to do this because you've never been taught it. And that's a big aha moment, where it doesn't matter if you're 20 or 30 or 50, just because you've been doing it for a long time doesn't mean you get better at it, which is the perfect segue to understanding the difference between learning and performance. Because I have this debate all the time, but I didn't have the framework that I have now because of you. So talk to me about what you call the performance paradox.
Sure. And just to be very clear, because I think you and I both we don't mean that, educators are evil or are doing a poor job. It's just that the system is not set up, or is the goals of schools and education is not to develop lifelong learners. That's not in the standards. That's not in what schools are being asked to do, right? And there's a lot of systems around other goals that make the educators role difficult. But that said, we can continue to grow as educators, just like in any profession. We can get better at what we do. We can work within the system and within the confines and the constraints, and foster a growth mindset and creativity and passion in our students too.
I'm glad you said that, and I want to interrupt you for a second because I need to emphasize this too. For those that don't know, my wife is a third grade teacher. My father is a teacher. My mom was a teacher. My sister is a fourth grade or third, I don't know, some elementary school teacher. So I want to make it clear that if anybody didn't get this sense from me and you help correct me, this isn't about the teachers. This is about the system and the way the system is designed. And I've had this conversation with my wife more than once, where I tell her that the vast majority, especially now with the advent of AI, the vast majority of what you're teaching your students in third grade, they're not going to be able to use, and it's not going to be useful to them when they graduate high school. The reason you're such a great teacher is you instill the belief in your students that they can. You instill the belief that somebody cares about them and wants to see them succeed. But her teaching, civics or whatever, this or that or the other thing, the system itself is the problem and not the teacher. So I'm glad you emphasized that, because teachers and teaching is my entire livelihood. My problem is with the system. That's where my frustration is.
Yes, and hopefully we'll continue to change the system. And I've been to the White House a few times to convenings about this, and I do think that policymakers are making progress and will continue to make progress around this. And my wife was a second grade bilingual teacher. She's a professor of education now, so I am passionate about education as well. But one of the things that happens in school and the system, and this gets to your question about the performance paradox, is that very often what students are doing in school is doing something for a grade, right? They're tasked with something that is going to get graded and it's going to get a number or a letter on it. So what is what message does that send? That sends the message that what we want kids to do is to be able to be doing everything well all the time, ideally perfectly, right? Ideally we want them to get 100 on everything they're doing every day. And that sends the message that we want them to be doing things they already know how to do, not things that they don't know how to do, that they're grappling with, that they're making mistakes with, like to your point about failure, so that we can learn from where those mistakes are, examine them, and say, oh, this is where I went wrong. This is how I can get better, right? And so instead, in school, to start in schools, and then we can talk about kind of what the implications are for us now. Instead, what could happen in school is most of the time should be focused on learning, which means students should be doing things they don't know how to do, making lots of mistakes, talking about those mistakes and examining them. So if we put a problem in front of a class and a lot of people don't know how to do it, we shouldn't ask who knows how to do it, have them explain how to do it, and then move to the next problem. Instead, we should think about and examine all the problems that happen and examine them and think about where did this go wrong and what can we learn from this, and let's think about this mistake, and let's talk about mistakes a lot more than let's talk about how to do it right? And so the distinction between those two things is what I call the learning zone, which is when we're focused on learning. We're doing things we don't know how to do. We're going beyond what we know. That's when we're focused on improvement. And the performance zone, which is when we're assessing ourselves, we're testing ourselves, we're trying to get things done. So to make an analogy, in sports, for example, if you're playing a championship final, it's a high stakes game that you want to win. You're in your performance zone. You're trying to do the things you already know how to do well. If you're having trouble with your top spin serve in tennis, you're going to avoid that move during the match, because all you want to do is win. But then after the match, you're going to go to your coach and say, Coach, I have to work on my top spin serve. Let's spend an hour working on that. That's a very, very different activity and area of attention than what we do during the match. And the best tennis players, or any athlete, they get so good because they spend a lot of time in the learning zone working on how to improve, which is different from executing and performing. And for most of us in work and life, we get stuck in the performance zone, just always trying to do things as best as we know how, trying to minimize mistakes, and that leads to stagnation. So the performance paradox is the counterintuitive phenomenon that if we just get fixating on performing, our performance suffers. Our results are lower if we're only focused on performance.
Yeah, and the counterintuitive thing about this that I found so fascinating, both in the work that you've done, but just discovering this over and over and over, is we make the assumption that those that are new to something, they're the ones that are doing all the learning. Then you cross this threshold where now you're elite. But the craziest thing that I've seen over and over and over across multiple disciplines and music and sports and everything else is that it's the absolute best that whether they've won or lost, they break down the game tape, so to speak, afterwards. And you gave an example in your TED talk about Beyonce, because you think, well, if there's anybody that's achieved a level of perfection and only needs to show up performing, it's Beyonce. She's the best in the world at what she does, or maybe now number two to Taylor Swift. But if we're talking about Beyonce, she clearly just chills out after she's done with the performance, right?
Right. No. So yeah, Beyonce, after each performance, she goes to her hotel room and she reviews tape. She reviews a video of the performance. She makes notes, lots of notes about what could be improved, whether it is her hair or her movement or the lights or people around her. And she shares notes with everybody in her team so that the next day they can work on some things before the next performance. So it is, the performance is the performance zone. They're trying to do things as best as they can, but then afterwards they are doing things very deliberately to continue to get even better. And those people, to your point, that are fantastic and the best at what they do, they continue to work to get even better.
So having said that, if we're looking at whether it's Beyonce, like Kobe, LeBron, they're all the kind that like they win the championship and the next morning they're figuring out what do I need to do better between now and next year, which to, you know, a layperson would seem absurd. What one of the things that drives me crazy, and I'm going to do my best to not get on a soapbox and turn into a grumpy old man, but I might for a few minutes here and there. It's when I see people that are more seasoned or experienced in an industry, and I see this in Hollywood all the time, that are responding to questions or comments in social media. They say, I've been doing this for 30 years. And my response is, it doesn't mean you've been doing it well for 30 years or been doing it right. Like, I've had a driver's license since I was 16. I'm not ready for NASCAR, right? So let's dig a little bit deeper into the differences between the learning and the performance zone, so people realize that experience does not equal expertise or the fact that they're moving forwards.
Absolutely. You know, it's to your point about the difference between experience and expertise. There's research out of Harvard. They took over 60 research studies that looked at the relationship for doctors, for medical doctors, between experience, which is the years on the job, and expertise, which is how good they are at their job, their patient outcomes. And what they found is that on average, the more years of experience that medical professionals were on the job, the worse their patient outcomes. They actually became worse over time. On average, obviously not everybody. There are doctors that have great learning habits and get better over time and better, just like Beyonce or Kobe, right? But on average, they got worse because they're so busy executing, performing, seeing patients, right? Diagnosing, prescribing, treating, that, and they do it with their greatest care because they care about patients and they want to help people, right? But what happens is that first the world changes, right? New technologies happen, the world changes in different ways, and we are kind of staying stuck behind. But second, we also might, and they forget information that's relevant to infrequent diagnosis, so that when somebody comes with an infrequent illness, they might not realize it, whereas somebody who is kind of fresh out of school kind of will remember that better because they just studied it more recently. So that happens in, you know, whether it's in chess or in surgery. And so there's a difference, right? It doesn't mean you can become really skilled pretty young if you're a really great learner. And of course, you can always continue to get better, but it involves being deliberate about continuing to get better. And to your point about when leaders, whether they have 30 years on the job or 2 years on the job, when leaders act like know-it-alls, that's very detrimental to their teams and their organizations, because that's what other people emulate, right? People say, okay, in this organization, what gives you status is to know a lot and to be a know-it-all and to be sure of yourself and not to listen to other people. So that's what I'm going to do too. And so when it becomes know-it-all organization, you know, it just, the organization doesn't change, doesn't learn, and goes under.
Yeah. So this is not a thread that I want to pull on because I don't know this for certain, but I have a feeling the mention of this alone could lead to a 2-hour conversation. I'm going to put a link in the show notes to something that's called the Dunning-Kruger effect. Because the Dunning-Kruger effect, when you think I know it all, that's actually peak stupidity. And the more you learn something, the more you realize how little you actually know. And this is going to be a little bit of a deviation from that, because again, this could be an entire conversation. But one thing that I want to bring up specifically about the value of learning and how it relates to performance, I had a realization, give or take, maybe 5 to 10 years ago, that I had crossed that threshold from I was no longer learning and growing and excited about the craft and learning new tools. I was now the curmudgeon that didn't want to learn the new tools. And I realized I don't want to be in the learning zone with what I'm doing anymore. I'm at a high level in the performance zone, but as soon as I lost the interest in going back to the learning zone, that's when I said, it's time to do something else. And now that I've very much diversified, not just editing television and movies, but doing the podcasting, doing the writing, doing the coaching, doing American Ninja Warrior, all these other things, the value that I've seen in diversification is 100-fold, because there's always something new for me to learn that motivates me to learn something else. And you may be familiar with David Epstein, who wrote the book Range, another person
Great
on
book.
my podcast bucket list. I really want people to better understand both the value of diversification and this first mover's advantage, specifically now that we're moving into this world of the AI revolution for creatives. And the reason that I think it's so important to bring you on to talk about this is because the most important thing we have to be willing to embrace in this transition is learning and failure. So talk to me a little bit more about how this diversification of interest and this desire to learn ultimately is going to allow people to learn better, but it might not be the straight and narrow path right to the shore.
Great. Well, if I had a podcast, David Epstein would also be in my podcast bucket list, as Carol Dweck. That's a great book, Range. So to your point, you got to the point where you didn't have that passion to continue to learn the skills that you already were executing at a very high level of performance. One thing that I want to point out about that is that in a growth mindset or a learning orientation doesn't mean that we need to be learning everything all the time. In fact, that's not effective, right? To try to just learn everything all the time, that just doesn't make sense. We have to be strategic. I mean, exploring and tinkering broadly and following our curiosity is great, but also if we want to become great at something that we're interested in and passionate about, also having some focus and choosing what things we want to get better at is also something that's of a lot of value. So what I heard from you is you developed some great skills in editing and production and media and Hollywood. And you probably use a lot of those skills today, right? You have expanded and you have learned new skills and used them in different ways and connected those new skills with the skills that you built earlier on in your career. And that's wonderful. So there are things where we might make the choice, like you probably have, of, okay, in this particular area I've become really good at, I'm going to be more in the performance zone in these skills because I'm going to focus my learning zone on these other skills. And the combination of the two are going to bring something special, a podcast, Optimize Yourself, that is going to be kind of different and add some unique value to the world. So yes, when we broaden our horizons, there's a lot of benefits that come from that. We connect the disconnected. We have a greater understanding also of how systems work, and systems thinking is a really important way to solve problems and to lead to creativity, right? We understand how the world works, how different things connect to each other, and that enables us to better contribute in ways that are different than if we just work in silos without a broader view of the world.
Yeah. And speaking of connections, and a totally shameless plug in to help the listener navigate a couple of these things, I could talk about systems for days and days, and I have. So I'm going to link to the episode that I did talking to James Clear about habit building and systems building. I'm also going to link to an episode that I did with Joey Cofone that's all about the laws of creativity and how you can break down creativity as not just generating new and original ideas, but combining existing ideas. So I just want to make sure anybody that's like, ooh, this is fascinating and I want to go deeper, until that David Epstein episode exists, and it will exist, trust me, at some point. But I want to send people both to James Clear to learn about systems, Joey Cofone to learn about creativity. But going back a second, I think this is going to be really valuable to hit this point home where you had said, you don't have to learn all the time, you still need to perform. Here's the realization that I had, and it took a while to get there. When I was younger, yeah, there were times of performance, like I've got a big episode or a big film and I got to be in performance mode and I got to cut and I got to meet deadlines. But as soon as the pressure was off, it was always, what's next? What can I learn next? What's the new tool? Or I'm going to watch action movies all day long to understand how action montages are cut together or music choices are made. But then the transition happened where as soon as I was out of performance mode working on a big TV show, it was, I want to learn WordPress and I want to understand how to build a podcast. And there's a part of me that's like, ugh, what is wrong with you? You're so scatterbrained. Can you stay focused on the task at hand and stay in your lane, right? And I didn't realize how valuable now in hindsight, 10 years later, that diversification was. And I started to follow that intuition more and more, where if I have this idea that I want to learn or a skill I want to develop, it's not a matter of stay in your lane. That's not what you do anymore. This is the thing you do. I can't imagine if I hadn't pulled on the thread. Well, what if I wanted to learn to become an American Ninja Warrior? That one thread changed my whole life, but I didn't believe I had permission, because it's always about do your one thing and stay in your lane. But the level of diversification that I've gotten has served me so well. But it really was that realization of I want to learn, I just don't want to learn this thing anymore. And it took me a while to give myself permission to do that.
I can resonate with what you're saying. And one thing I wanted to point out is, we can think about the learning zone, the performance zone, as we're either learning or performing. And sometimes that's true. We can dedicate some time only to learning and some time only to performing. But for most of us, the biggest opportunity is in combining the two and learning while doing. We don't actually learn by doing. Simply by doing something, we learn only if we're novices. Once we become proficient, just doing something is going to not make you get better unless you do it in a way that's deliberate to improvement. So we need to be trying something different, right? Doing an experiment, soliciting feedback, thinking about the mistakes that we're making and what we can learn from them. Those are things that are different than simply doing. But for most of us, we're so busy getting so much done. It's about trying new things as we're doing those things, experimenting and tinkering with new ways of working so that we can get better over time. So that we're combining learning and performing at the same time as we're getting things done. Sometimes it is time to just focus on performing and not worry about learning. And those times are either when the stakes are really high, right? If you're doing something that if you make a mistake, it's going to have big consequences. You're going to try to minimize mistakes. So you're going to try to focus on what you know works. So that's one. And the second is sometimes we can make kind of a tactical decision to just focus on performance when the short-term goals are really important. We have this week, we have to get this really important thing done. And I don't have enough time. I'm not going to sleep enough. So I'm just going to focus on performing and getting it done. But if we do that every week, then we stagnate.
I was going to say that's basically the story of most people's lives right now. Have you seen my calendar? Where exactly would you like me to fit learning when all I'm doing is keeping my head above water? It's performance mode 24/7. As soon as you meet one unrealistic expectation, well, then today's miracle becomes tomorrow's expectation. Rinse, lather, and repeat. So how do I learn more effectively in this environment of doing 24/7?
Yeah. So the first step is the realization that if we are in that hamster wheel, if we are treading water, the realization that if we continue in the same way, we're going to continue in the hamster wheel and treading water, right? So that's the first step is identifying the problem and identifying that if I find a way to embed a little bit of learning every day or every week, and I start getting better, then I'm going to be able to get more results in less time, which is going to make a bit more time for both learning and performance. That's going to that's going to make even a little more time, right, to get more results in less time. And then it's going to get easier and easier to accelerate and get better over time. I call that the flywheel of competence. So the flywheels are like really heavy wheels that are hard to start turning. But when you start turning them, like just the angular momentum is easier to turn and turn and turn until they become unstoppable. It's hard to stop them, right? And that's when we start embedding kind of learning habits into the way we do things and the way that we live and we work. Then we get into the flywheel of competence, and things become easier and easier over time for us to become more skilled. And so the way to start is to start with something quick and simple, right? And that doesn't take a lot of effort. To your point about James Clear and the Atomic Habits, or BJ Fogg and Tiny Habits, it's, we can identify what is something really quick and easy that I can start doing every day, that doesn't take much time at all. And then that's going to start a seed, right? And it's going to be a lot easier for us to expand from there. Something really quick that any of us can do every day that I think is really powerful is to remind ourselves every morning of what one thing we're working to improve. Just like write it down on a piece of paper, look at it at the same time in the morning every day. That's going to seed your intention to get better at something. It's going to help you notice opportunities to get better at that throughout your day as you go about your day. And that's going to prime a growth mindset and the learning zone. And that's a great way to start.
It's funny because we're basically going to be establishing a table of contents for all of my favorite episodes. For anybody that wants to learn more about the one thing, visit my episode with Jay Papazan talking all about the one thing. Either you've reviewed all of my episodes already, or clearly you and I are operating on the same wavelength. But this is the foundation of everything that I teach, is you got to break it down to little pieces. And I have found that for me, and I think for most of the students in my program, that little place to start is a podcast interview just like this one, where you hear the conversation. We're going to talk for 90 minutes and somebody's going to come away with one little kernel of an idea, and they're going to say, I want to go deeper into it. So maybe they join a mailing list, maybe they do a workshop, and then all of a sudden they've been in my community for 3 years and they don't even know where it started. It started with that one thing. I'm just going to listen to a podcast and force myself to learn, rather than if I'm in the car or exercising or doing dishes or whatever, I'm just going to use music or distractions. If you switch that switch in your brain to say, nope, I'm in learning mode, the tiniest little bits are going to lead to a lot more momentum. Like you said, the flywheel effect. Because I often get into the trap of, man, my entire calendar is all work, doing. The time that I feel like I'm breathing is when I'm in learning mode, when I'm reading a book, when I'm listening to a podcast while I'm taking a walk. That to me is re-energizing. So I find a way very meticulously, with the math included, how can I balance the amount of hours in the week between I'm in doing mode, or as you would say in performance mode, versus learning mode. So let's assume that we've gotten past this idea of there's no way I have enough time, and people start to embrace this idea of doing learning. There are two things that we would both agree that they're going to run up against fairly quickly, which is, how do I deal with the different types of mistakes that I'm going to make, and how do I start receiving and giving feedback? So let's start to break down different types of mistakes, because I know that it's not just, oh, I screwed up and I failed. You've created a great framework for understanding the different types of mistakes that we're going to encounter when we're in learning mode.
Yeah, sometimes, as I've gone through my journey, sometimes I've heard mistakes described as, mistakes are wonderful, we want to make mistakes and learn from them, which in some ways resonates with me. But it's also true that mistakes can be detrimental. Mistakes can lead to death. They can lead to people getting hurt. It can lead to, losing customers. And so getting a little bit clear about what are different kinds of mistakes and how do we want to engage in them, and how can we best learn from different types of mistakes is helpful. So in chapter 5, it's all about kind of 4 different types of mistakes. One is the stretch mistakes. The stretch mistakes happen when we're trying something we haven't done before, or going beyond what we can already do well. And we're tinkering, we're trying new skills, we're experimenting, and we are bound to make mistakes because we are going beyond what we know. And those are those are fantastic mistakes to be deliberate about, right? But we want to figure out, what are the times and spaces where I can take risk, where I can experiment, where I'm not gonna create a lot of damage, right? Because I've created safety islands that I can tinker and experiment with and be creative around, right? So those are the stretch mistakes. We want to be proactive about making stretch mistakes by taking on things that are challenging and experimenting. Then there's the high stakes mistakes, which are mistakes that if we make those mistakes, there's going to be big negative consequences. And so we want to try to minimize that, right? Beyonce is not not setting out to try something new and experimenting when she's in front of 80,000 people. She'll do that like backstage, where she's working with her team. And so that's the low stakes versus the high stakes. And so we want to, when the stakes are high, especially when people can get hurt or when our company can go down, we want to put our best foot forward. But that should be a very small percentage of the time for most of us in our job, unless we're in charge of security at a nuclear plant or something like that. Then there's the sloppy mistakes, which is when we do something poorly and it's something that we should know better. We already know how to do this thing and we just made a sloppy mistake. And often when we think about, why did I do this sloppy mistake? How can I prevent this in the future? Often the answer is about kind of focus, about I was trying to think about too many things at the same time. And I need to think about what systems I put in place to be able to foster more focus. So if it's important, if it's meaningful, and I really want to try to avoid that mistake, I want to think about how do I avoid this mistake? The answer is often, how do I foster more focus? That said, for me, when I make sloppy mistakes, often they're also a source of joy. There's something that, okay, like I was focused on this other thing. I made a sloppy mistake in the periphery. It's not important. It's funny. Let's just laugh about it. I sometimes share it with family or friends, post a picture of it on Facebook, whatever it is, right? So mistakes can also bring us joy and kind of humanity to our lives. And then the fourth kind of mistake is the aha moment mistake, which is when we do something as we intended, but then we realize that it was the wrong thing to do. We realized there was something we were missing. There was a blind spot, and what we did created a consequence that we didn't expect. And those mistakes are precious, that we can learn so much from aha moment mistakes. So when they happen, we can't proactively elicit them like we can elicit stretch mistakes, but when they happen, we need to treasure them and think about, what can I learn from this gift of this aha moment mistake that I just made?
Yeah, and I think that just about anybody in a creative field, especially those that are editors like myself, the aha moment mistake is the one that we wish we knew how to replicate. It's where, oh, I'm going to put this in here and this together. Oh, crap, I hit the wrong button. Whoa, what just happened? Right? Like I never in a million years would have thought to put shot A next to shot X, but yes, this is the crux of the entire scene, right? Those aha moments are amazing. They're hard to replicate. And I found a couple of practices and ways to make them, to get quote unquote lucky a little bit more often, but you're right that they're kind of like serendipity. But the one of these four that I think is the most important for people to really both understand and embrace is the stretch mistake. Because I've done entire presentations where I talk about there's literally one key to success in achieving any goal in any field. I firmly believe this. You can simplify it down to, you find the hardest version of what you can do and you do something slightly harder, because it's going to force you to fail, but you're going to iterate in a safe space and you're going to grow faster. And I learned this lesson through learning how to become an American Ninja Warrior. So the simple example I get is, if you have a rope and you've never climbed a rope before and you're thinking, well, I don't know, maybe I could climb 10 feet. Well, great. Your goal right now is climb 15 feet, right? Because you're not going to do it the first time, but you're going to learn all of the obstacles standing between you and the goal, and you can iterate faster. But you're also going to be in a place where the failure is kind of fun. So one of the 2 years that I got the casting call to be on the show, my entire reel was my failures. It was me falling over and over and over and over and over and over, because that's a huge part of my story and how it leads to growth. And of course I capped it off with, well, I've learned a few things and I can do some cool stuff too. But most of it was, here are all the things that I've done wrong. And I didn't realize how valuable deliberately designing a life around stretch mistakes was. So what have you found, either through your own work or through research, about the value in creating these stretch mistakes?
Absolutely. So, what you described, part of what you describe is called deliberate practice, right? Which was discovered and coined by Florida State professor Anders Ericsson, who wrote the book Peak. And, unfortunately he passed away a couple of years ago, but he was another treasured mentor of mine, and I'm honored to build on his work. And what he found is that the people who become most skilled in their domains, they engage in deliberate practice, which is just what you said, right? It's about identifying a specific sub skill that we want to improve. So it's not like I want to become a better ninja warrior. I want to get better at climbing the rope, right? So it's like it's a skill, and it's about identifying something slightly beyond what we can do, right? And trying it, failing, and figuring out how we can adjust. So if we're, for example, playing golf, when we're in a tournament on the range, we're trying to do things as best as we can. But then on the course, but when we go to the range and we're practicing, we are testing different things. We're saying, okay, I want to try to use and I don't play golf, but I want to try to use the 5 club, and I'm going to try to like tweak my swing in this particular way and see what that does. And that's probably going to lead the ball to go too much to the right. So then I'm going to adjust my club a little bit to the left, right? And so we're making mistakes and making adjustments based on what those mistakes do. The mistakes are feedback to us. And that is how the best people in the world get better. I'm curious, Zach, do you have an example on the creative field, right? On something where in your creative work of what kind of stretch mistakes could look like?
Yeah, so I'm so glad you brought this up, because I was going to actually talk about this anyways. Again, you and I totally on the same wavelength. And this was the difference between I'm in learning mode versus I'm in performance mode and I'm not interested in learning anymore. So when I started to learn more about peak performance and psychology and time management and all these things, what ended up happening in the evolution of my editing career is I was no longer in learning mode on how do I cut a better scene or how do I cut a cooler montage. It was how can I be more effective in less time? Because I had kids and I didn't want to be in the edit suite for 80 hours a week. So I thought I'm going to gamify and I'm going to learn how to cut faster without the quality going down. So I started to ask myself the question, if I've got, 1 hour of raw dailies or 2 hours or whatever it is, what's the fastest that I can cut it and still deliver the same result? So I was actually time blocking on my calendar and doing the math and setting timers. So it wasn't so much I want to make better creative choices per se. It was how can I maintain my level of creative choices and do it in less time? And that completely changed the game and changed my entire career. And what I found by default is that forcing myself to fail forced me to learn new things about the creative process, so that I was all of a sudden growing more creatively. Even though all I wanted to do was become more efficient, I also became more effective. One of the things I did early in my career, and people think this is crazy because I have these diverging or now converging interests of athletics in creative work. I thought, well, what if I created drills? What if I actually drilled myself on these key skills? One of them was being as fast as possible, hitting all the hotkeys that I hit the most without looking down at my keyboard. And I would map my keyboard, not mnemonically, where it's like S is for slip and B is for razor blade. It was more based on the distance of the keys to my fingers. How do I map it so I know that if I use my index finger all day long, what key should that be? And forcing myself to not use the mouse, and I wasn't allowed to look at my keyboard to see, can I get faster making these creative choices? And these all compounded to, I was doing the same amount or more work at a higher level in way less time. So that's an example of how I was really creating these stretch mistakes to get better creatively.
Fantastic. I can picture how you were cutting the video pitch for the American Ninja Warrior, and how your skills between, cutting video and athletics came together beautifully there. And what you bring about in terms of the keyboard is also an area that Anders Ericsson and his colleagues studied. And it's something that probably a lot of us can relate to, because think about how many hours we spent writing kind of emails and writing documents over our lives. We spend so many hours doing, like, typing, but most of us haven't become world class at it, even though we spend so many hours typing, right? And so the people who become like twice as fast and twice as accurate as most of us, they spend like 10 to 20 minutes each day, fully concentrated, trying to type 10 to 20% faster than they're comfortable with. So they're making a lot of mistakes as they're trying to do that. And they examine what words led them to make mistakes, and they practice the same day in the same way, but using text that leads them to make lots of mistakes. So the difficult words, they try to type those faster each for 10 to 20 minutes every day. And over time, they become so much better and so much faster, just like you did.
It's funny because you're reminding me how big of a nerd I really am, and I didn't realize it because I don't remember when it was. I think it was before I had kids, but it was probably give or take about 15 years ago. I would spend 30 minutes a day doing online games where you were gamifying how many words you could type per minute because I felt like I was really clunky on the keyboard. So I was like, nope, I'm going to play this game. What's my word count now? And it would be exercises like FFFG, FFFFFH. And it was actually really, really fun. It was like a nice diversion. But I got significantly better at typing more efficiently and typing faster. And you put all those things together, one of the pieces of feedback that I get all the time and have for years from producers and directors is they're like, I've never seen anybody do this faster than you do it. And again, it goes back to the beginning of the conversation. I'm not genetically gifted with the ability to edit fast. I drilled it over and over and over, not because I want to be faster, because I want to get the hell out of my office at the end of the day. Right. Yeah. So there was a means to an end where I was willing to make those mistakes. But here's the next part that I think is so important for people to understand. Most of the mistakes that you're going to make, you're not going to realize you're making them unless you have somebody that's giving you feedback and iterating. So I want to talk a little bit more now about this process of how you can elicit feedback and how you can surround yourself and create a positive feedback loop. Because yeah, if you're on the golf course and you make a mistake, you can be all by yourself and you're like, oh, the shot didn't go far enough or it sliced to the left. But especially in creative fields, we have to learn how to take feedback, but not turn it into criticism. So how can we learn to both ask for better feedback and give better feedback?
Sure. So feedback is so powerful. I think it's probably the most powerful learning strategy in most workplaces because we are social beings, right? So we're collaborating, we're trying to create things to have an effect on other people, whether it's to entertain them or delight them or do any sort of both collaboration and effect on other human beings. And so what effect we have, we do something and we think that it's going to have an effect on other people, but we're usually a little off, right? It usually, like whether it is, we create a different better effect or a different worse effect than we thought, there's usually something there for us to learn. And so by making what is in other people's mind visible to us, we can learn so much about how our behavior affects them. And the most important thing is just to solicit feedback frequently and often from a variety of people, not just from one person. Because when we solicit feedback, first of all, it puts us into a learning mindset, right? It reminds us that we want to learn. Second, it makes it easier for the other person to give us feedback because a lot of us are afraid to give feedback because the other person might react defensively. We might think they might not want feedback. So if somebody asks for my feedback, then it makes it a lot easier for me to give it. And usually the feedback's a lot more specific and useful. It's related to something that I'm curious about or want to learn about. So when I solicit feedback, I make it easy for other people to give it. Often when we solicit feedback though, often other people respond by saying that was great or that was wonderful. And so when that happens, I say that's great, but can you say more about what was helpful, and especially if there's something that I can do better, like what is one thing that I could do better, right? So pushing them a little bit to, can you give me some information either about kind of the things that were particularly helpful so I know to continue doing them, or ideally also something that I can change to try to continue to get better. So we need to extract that a little bit from other people because often people are afraid because they think that you're gonna react defensively. And when we give feedback, ideally, again, like the other person is soliciting it, but that how we give it depends a lot on our relationship, our trust, our common understanding of feedback. Like if people see feedback as something that is a sign of weakness, something that is a sign of incompetence, then if we give feedback, other people are gonna just react defensively and they're gonna get upset at us. So ideally, if we have colleagues that we work with or we have our family, we want to have conversations about the learning zone, about feedback, what these things are, why we want them in our lives. So we get on the same page and we can start these conversations and develop habits of soliciting feedback and learning from one another.
Yeah. So let's assume that I completely and totally buy the premise of I need to solicit feedback. The big giant question that you kind of answered a little bit that I want to really pull this thread a lot deeper is how do I solicit feedback? And I think it's a two-part question. The first of which, and this is something that I teach extensively in my program, and I say this over and over to my students, the quality of the answer that you get is going to be based on the quality of your question. So if your question is, what did you think? You're going to get a really crappy generic answer, as opposed to, I was thinking that in this section, I wanted this result. Like in a simple example, I really wanted you to laugh right there, but you didn't laugh. Can you give me a sense of why you didn't think that was funny? Right? Well, that's going to come off as, ooh, that's a really good question. Let me break that down to help you. But then the second part beyond how do I ask the right questions to solicit feedback, it's how do I overcome the fear that I sound incompetent, or it's embarrassing to have made mistakes, or it's embarrassing to be asking for feedback at all because that means I'm imperfect and I should have this all figured out. So it's how do I ask these questions, but how do I overcome the fear of asking the question at all?
Yeah, so a couple of things. So for example, when I'm a public speaker, I do keynotes. After my keynotes, I want to solicit feedback, right? So often I embed the feedback into live polling. I use live polling to make the sessions interactive. And then the last question or the last two questions are for me to get feedback and to think about what worked well and what I could improve. And that's embedded into the session. But whether I do that or not, I also want to later kind of solicit feedback from people who were there, who attended in conversation. And I could just say, what could I do better? And that would be fine. But I say, as you know, I'm a big fan of feedback. I would love kind of your thoughts on what was helpful to you, or what is one thing I could do better. And just I'm reminding them that feedback is something that we can all benefit from, and that the most skilled people do, right? So that I don't come across as incompetent if they think that people who solicit feedback are not confident, right? So that one thing is framing. So we want to get on the same page about what feedback is, and we can do that quickly when we're soliciting feedback. As you know, I'm a big fan of feedback. I would love your thoughts. Right now, I am, and I spent the last 3 years writing this book, The Performance Paradox. And a key part of that was soliciting feedback. I mean, I had so many readers read things and provide feedback on the drafts. And even now that the book is ready and is finished, I love to solicit feedback from readers to learn more about how it lands and how it's helpful or not to different people. So if I ask, what do you think of my book? That's really hard for people to like. It's a big question. It's almost like it's really difficult to answer, right? So the way that I'm soliciting feedback right now, I might find ways to get it better at soliciting feedback. But what I'm saying for people who want to read the whole book is, what are the chapters that were most helpful to you, and why? And are there some things that you wish that I had gone deeper on in the book that I didn't go deeper on? Those are two questions that I'm asking, that I'm finding helpful when people answer. But I feel like the questions we ask might depend a little bit on what we're working on, what the situation is, what our relationship is with the person. But I'd be curious in your perspectives, because I suspect that you have some other kind of insights and strategies around how to solicit feedback.
I definitely do. And I love how you've turned this into you're the podcast host and not the guest. I love conversations like that. So yes, this is something that I thought about extensively. And again, I've done a lot of A/B testing in many rooms and trying different ways to ask similar questions and what's a response from this director versus that director. And I agree that as we talked about already, the quality of the question is going to really dictate the quality of the answer. And one thing that I want to bring up to add to what you said is that the timing of the type of feedback matters as well, right? So my guess is the reason you formulated your questions about which chapters resonated with you the most and what do you wish I had gone deeper on that I didn't, that feedback informs another book, right? Now let's imagine you asked what I believe to be a great question at the wrong time, right? So I'm going to steal this question blatantly from one of my mentors, probably again, somebody in our similar circle, Adam Grant. So Adam Grant creates what he calls a challenge network. And one of the questions that he asks, which has gotten me by far the best feedback I've ever had on speeches, on classes, on presentations, even if you enjoyed this, if you were forced to cut 20%, what would you take out? And individually, I probably wouldn't take most of the feedback. But what I notice are patterns. And when I ask 50 people the same question and one of them says, oh, well, this is the dumbest thing you mentioned, like, well, 49 people said this is their favorite part of the presentation, so thanks, but no thanks. But if 15 people all said, it took me a little while to really get sucked in, well, that means if I'm going to cut 20% or even just 10, it's probably in the beginning. So it's about asking a really specific question. But if you were to ask people now, if you went out to all the people with your finished published book, if I were to cut 20%, which would I cut? A little late for that question, isn't it? Already published.
Yeah, I agree, and that is, you remind me of a question that I sometimes ask, which is in the keynotes I do. Sometimes I ask that question. If you were to cut something, what would you cut? And that gives me very useful information. Yeah,
and that's something that I have certainly used a lot as well. Where sometimes it's thrust upon me by either a timing requirement or a studio or whatever it might be. But an example would be that if I'm cutting an episode of TV or cutting a movie, and the general consensus is it's just a little sluggish. It feels a little slow. Great. What are your suggestions? I don't know. I don't know what I would do with that. I feel it, but I don't know how to tell you what the solution is. What I find, especially, and if we're going to dig deeper into this idea of how to ask the right questions and get the most effective feedback, what I think the mistake that most people make, and I see it mostly in my world of editing, but I think it can be applied almost anywhere. The question they're asking is, tell me what to do and give me the solution. The question needs to be, tell me what isn't working, and it's my job to solve it. So it's not a matter of, well, if the scene is too long, tell me what shots or what lines of dialogue you want cut. I don't know. Okay, well, tell me what feeling you didn't get that you wanted. I wanted the scene to move faster. Great. Let me figure out what the solution is. So I'm always pushing to get feedback on what isn't working and how do you feel that and what are you feeling that you don't want to be feeling, or what do you, more, what is your experience of it versus tell me what to do. And I think the lazy version of feedback is give me the notes and give me the solutions and I'll execute them. Right. So that comes back to the quality of the question.
That makes a lot of sense. And it also makes particular sense in kind of creative fields, or you're the expert in your craft, right? And you want to create an effect on the person that you're talking to. So you're getting feedback on the effect you're having, and you're the expert who's gonna come up with a solution to the effect that you want to have.
Mm-hmm. So I had put a pin in this before, and we're really close to pulling this pin out. We're one question away, but I want to frame up where I want to end is I really want people to understand how to create a more effective learning environment and better systems. And you've broken down kind of these 4 basic steps. And I want to get to those because I love myself. I love me some frameworks. Let's just take something really complex and simplify it. But there's one thing that I want to put in between that, which is, given the amount of information that we now have available to us and the amount of things that we need to learn or we want to learn, especially right now in creative fields, we are being bombarded with 87 different AI tools every single day. How do we actually distill down, and what suggestions do you have for, like, this is the thread that maybe I should pull? And then once we figure out what we want to learn next, I want to talk about how to create this high performance learning environment.
I would love your thoughts on that, because I feel like you probably had a lot of thinking around this. But what my reaction might be that we want to tinker broadly to get a sense of what kinds of tools are there out there and what might be most useful to me right now in what I'm doing, what might be the greatest opportunity, and then tinker more with that tool, start using it, and figure out how do I collaborate with this tool so that in combination with a tool, we can create something even better than I was able to do without the tool. So that's my reaction, but I love your thoughts on it.
Yeah, so the way that I would break it down is very similar to a lot of things we've already talked about, is I would use this methodology of the one thing in conjunction with this idea of making a stretch mistake and going further outside my comfort zone. So like you said, I would start really broad. So if I go back 9 or 10 years ago where I decided, I think it's time to start looking into a career transition simultaneously with really taking care of my health and my well-being, one morning it was a podcast about sleep. Another morning it was a podcast about nutrition. This was about fitness. This was about circadian rhythm. This was about time management. This is about time, like so many different things coming at me, but it was kind of like I was at a buffet. It's like, I'm hungry for something new, but I don't even know what I like yet. So let me just eat a little bit of everything. But then all of a sudden I started to realize, if I pull this lever and I really focus on this lever just for now, not I have to decide what I'm going to be for the rest of my life. but if I just pull this lever, I think I'm going to get more leverage, so to speak, and it's going to get me more results. But it's also the area where I'm most excited to be making mistakes and learning. So it's kind of that intuition of like, this is like, for example, there was a point in which I'm like, I just want to do a deep dive into WordPress. And I made a really, really shitty first version of a website. But I was excited about making a shitty website because I was learning how WordPress works and how it thinks. And then as soon as I got to a point where I'm like, yeah, I've learned enough and I don't want to go any deeper and I don't want to learn code. Boom, here you go. You do WordPress for me, but I then had a language and I had a lingo. So for me, it's always about, there's so many broad things to learn. Which one gets me the most leverage, but where am I the most excited to just screw up and, like you said, tinker and make mistakes? Then all of a sudden that thread gets pulled. Like when I originally, I can't remember when exactly I discovered it. It was a little bit less than a year ago, but when I discovered David Epstein's book Range, it was just like, oh, I heard him on a podcast because of autoplay. I wasn't seeking out that idea at all. But all of a sudden, this kernel of the value of generalization, it just would not stop. It was like this little bug that was burrowing into the center of my brain. And I'm like, there's something here. And that led me to find other books and other topics and other conversations. And this is the only thread that I'm pulling right now. The time will come when I feel like I've done what I want to do with this. What's the next thread? So for me, that's kind of how I decide what it is that I want to learn and focus on next.
That makes sense. To expand on both our answers, and something you touched upon, but I wanted to call out, is when we're going broad and exploring lots of things, a mistake that I have made in the past is that I've gone about doing that in isolation by myself to the detriment of not asking somebody who knows already a lot or who is more experienced, like a mentor, for ideas and for them to point me in some directions, right? And so getting advice from people who are more experienced, being mindful of their time, but getting some quick pointers and some lay of the land is really useful. And then the other thing that you pointed out is that the value of dividing and conquering or collaborating, so that we don't need to become experts in everything that's important in our job. We can make decisions about, okay, this is one piece that I could learn how to do, but instead I'm going to collaborate with somebody who's really good at that so that I can focus on this other thing.
Yeah, and the piece of that I want to just double, triple, and quadruple down on, which is another one of the threads that I pulled, is that the fastest path to go from failing all the time to starting to succeed all the time is having a mentor, having an expert that's done exactly what you want to do next. And one of the areas that I did a super deep dive on is how can I learn how to better communicate with and surround myself with the world's experts on the things that I want to learn. So the only thread I was pulling was, how do I write an amazing cold outreach message to have anybody in the world mentor me on anything, which again, that was the one lever. I was dabbling with it, and I had some students say, hey, can you look at my outreach email, give me thoughts? I'm like, I guess, I mean, it's not really my thing, but I'll give you feedback. And then all of a sudden it became a thing. And then it became the foundation of everything that I teach. Because once you have this growth mindset and you want to learn something, and this learning becomes addictive, and you start to really get this flywheel moving, you don't want to sit around and have it take forever. You want to find somebody that can shorten your learning curve. So that was one of the areas that I really doubled down on, is how do I surround myself with mentors? It's one of the reasons I've got a podcast. Right? The podcast isn't generating a bunch of money for me. In fact, I barely break even, but the relationships that I build because I have these conversations is priceless compared to any sponsorship money or viewership or anything else. And that's a skill that I decided that I wanted to develop.
And part of the skill that you develop, Zach, I think, is kind of soliciting, like to your point about kind of how do I craft those messages to ask somebody whether they would be my mentor or help me in some way. And a lot of people trip around asking for help or making that ask because we are afraid of rejection, right? Mm-hmm. And it connects to your point earlier about soliciting feedback. We're afraid of rejection or of a comment that is not something that is a praise. And so we need to also kind of grapple with what feedback is, but also what asking for help is, and how do we frame what asking for help is so that we feel great about asking for help. And for me, asking for help is a way to connect with somebody, just like you said, to get to meet somebody, to build relationships, to give somebody else the opportunity to contribute. Like, I love to contribute to the world. Other people love to contribute to the world. If I am giving them the opportunity to help me and to contribute to somebody else, a lot of people appreciate that if I am being respectful of their time and using their time in a good way. I've done my homework. I'm thoughtful about what I'm asking them. I'm making great use of their time. And in fact, my book would not be there, we would not exist if I hadn't asked for help to somebody who has been mentioned in your podcast before, Chip Conley. I sent him an email asking him for help on something completely unrelated, and I didn't know him at all. And I just was hoping that he would reply by email, and he suggested that we speak and have a 20-minute call. And in that call, he suggested that I write a book, and he introduced me to a literary agent, and that's why I have a book now. So it is amazing how asking for help and what it can lead to, and what kinds of adventures and learning and contributions it can produce.
Anybody that's listening right now saying, oh my God, talk more about this. This is where we get this part 78 of our table of contents episode. Because I talk all about this idea that game recognizes game, and A gamers want to surround themselves with other A gamers, which is probably in your compelling pitch why Chip saw the value in connecting with you, and you weren't quote unquote bothering him or like, oh, I'm so desperate and I need your help. He sees a relationship that can be mutually beneficial. I talk about this extensively with Chase Jarvis. So once again, our table of contents episode, if you want to go deep into this concept about how to connect with a mentor and build a genuine relationship, just look for the episode with Chase Jarvis. Otherwise, I could literally talk about this for 4 hours, but we're running out of time. So
and by the way, I have now, like, to your point, Chip is a dear mentor and friend, and I know him really well. Spent a ton of time with him. I've been to Modern Elder Academy and spent a week with him in Mexico, and so it led to an incredible relationship just from asking for help. So yes, to your point, absolutely.
Yeah. So the final place that I want to end is the one that I've been promising this whole time. Like I said, I love me some simplified frameworks, and you have this very simple kind of 4-step bullet points for these are the steps required for high performance in developing effective learning. I want to break down what these are.
Can you mention the 4 steps?
Yeah. So it's this idea about that first, we have to believe that we can improve. Then we actually have to want to. Then we need to incorporate this deliberate practice and put ourselves in a low stakes situation. So essentially it's everything we've talked about, but I want to boil it down to just give me the steps, give me the checklist, because I think that we've already talked about them, but I want to package them succinctly.
Absolutely. Yeah. So sometimes growth mindset is painted as a silver bullet, right? If we just develop the belief that we can change, then everything changes. But a growth mindset is super, super powerful, that we talked about, but it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. So along with believing that we can change and improve, we also need to know how to improve. We need to know the difference between the learning zone and the performance zone, and how to build habits in our life to engage in both learning and performing. We also, number 3, to your point, need a purpose. We need something we care about. Like, why are we going to put effort into learning or into performing or into both? What is it that is interesting to me or that brings meaning and purpose for me to spend my energy on this thing rather than that thing? And finally, we want to be in a learning community. We want to be with other people who also see themselves as learners and who want to collaborate with us to help one another grow and improve. So when those 4 conditions are in place, then we become unstoppable. We are motivated and effective learners and performers.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up, because one of the things that I found so intriguing and very bold is fixed mindset versus growth mindset. So incredibly important. Thanks for all the work you've done, Carol. But here's what's missing. Here's what doesn't work. And then you expand it upon all of the building blocks that go on top of it, because it is simple enough to think, oh, well, now I have a growth mindset and I want to learn, so I'm all set. And you're like, not so fast. There needs to be more of a framework so that we can really build upon that. And I appreciated the fact that you went beyond the things that she's done, which again are just so seminal and have been life-changing for just the educational complex in general. But you're like, there's a little bit more that we need to talk about. Like, I appreciated that. So I could literally go on and on and on and on, but I want to be very respectful of your time. So the place that I want to leave our audience is the most important part, which is the shameless self-promotion portion of the program. So if I've been compelled to learn more either about you, your work, or more specifically, if I want to buy this book, where is the best place to send people?
Well, we talked about Mindset by Carol Dweck's, a seminal book about growth mindset. And then my book that just came out is called The Performance Paradox, Turning the Power of Mindset into Action. It's available wherever books are sold. I'm also active on LinkedIn, and I have a newsletter at briceño.com, my last name.com.
I love it. We're going to make sure that all those are included in the show notes. So then the final place to leave, is there anything that is absolutely vital that you want to share with the people listening today that we haven't already touched upon?
Just, I really appreciate the work that you are doing, Zack, and I've listened to some of the episodes. I've learned a lot from them, and I love how collaborative this conversation has been and how I've learned from you, and we've just kind of co-created together, which I think is part of creativity, right? It's not just doing things on our own, but also, a part of the range, part of tapping broadly is also tapping the expertise and the experiences that different people have and bringing them together. That is also part of creativity, and I think it's part of what we've done today.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So can't thank you enough for taking the time to be here and to share your expertise. Thank you.
Thank you, Zack.